The slap of boots on polished floor echoed like warning shots through Terminal 1 of Chicago's O'Hare Airport. What came next was not a terrorist attack, nor a national emergency, but something far more insidious. A man in a navy suit, tall, calm, precise, was slammed face-first against the cold tile wall by two uniformed officers. No gun, no threat, no resistance. Just skin color, and a vague, baseless report. It happened in less than 60 seconds. Gasps erupted from nearby passengers. Phones flew up. The sound of rolling suitcases halted. The airport did not go silent, it trembled. Because everyone watching knew, something was wrong. This wasn't security. It was a public execution of dignity. "Hands where I can see them," barked the older cop, his voice laced not with caution, but contempt. The man did not struggle. He didn't flinch. But in his stillness was a quiet storm. His name was Malcolm Reddick. At that moment, to those officers, he was just another black man walking alone in a first-class suit. To the rest of the country, though they didn't know it yet, he was the director of Homeland Counterintelligence. The most powerful intelligence official on U.S. soil. But power meant nothing when prejudice walked faster than reason. The story didn't begin at the wall. It began 20 minutes earlier, when Flight 218 from Berlin touched down on runway 28R, its tires screeching gently against the tarmac. The cabin lights blinked back to life as the aircraft coasted toward Gate B12. In Seat 2A sat Malcolm Reddick. A man who, despite decades in intelligence, still hated flying. He adjusted his cufflinks, breathed deeply, and prepared to disappear, as he always did, into the crowd. At 58, Malcolm had the aura of a man who had been forged in Cold War rooms and battlefield briefings. Tall, lean, composed, he wore silence like armor. His salt and pepper hair was clipped neatly. His suit, subtle, immaculate. His posture, relaxed but alert. Even now, after a 4-hour transatlantic flight and an unscheduled diplomatic detour in Brussels, he walked like a man trained to spot danger before it spotted him. He didn't carry an entourage. No security detail. No dark sunglasses or earpieces in his ear. Only a black leather briefcase tucked firmly under one arm and a soft leather satchel looped across his shoulder. Inside were encrypted files from a NATO cyber summit, a burner phone, and a worn photo of his daughter from 20 years ago. As he stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, Malcolm scanned the concourse with the subtle precision of habit. Faces. Body language. Abandoned bags. Exit signs. His mind, even after decades, never truly relaxed. 100 feet away, Officer Brock McKenna leaned against a pillar, thumbing his cracked police-issued tablet with one hand and sipping lukewarm coffee with the other. His skin was weathered from too many years under too few promotions. His eyes were tired, but sharp, in a bitter kind of way. Next to him stood Officer Darren Cole, 32, eager but insecure, the kind of officer who still asked before acting. Their beat today was the arrival hall at Gate B12, routine patrol, McKenna called it. Mostly standing. Some staring. Rarely policing. But routine was about to break. The tablet buzzed in McKenna's hand. A message from airport security, suspicious individual, black male, dark clothing, traveling alone, reportedly nervous, moving through B12 corridor. No known threat. McKenna grunted. That's helpful, he muttered, sarcasm curdling in his throat. Then he looked up. Through the sea of business travelers and sunburnt tourists, his eyes locked onto Malcolm Reddick. Tall. Alone. Dressed like a diplomat. Calm. Bingo, McKenna whispered, straightening up. He nudged Cole. You see him? That one right there. Fits the profile. Cole hesitated. He's just walking. And nervous. See the way he's looking around? That's called situational awareness, Cole replied carefully. McKenna shot him a glare. We don't get paid to theorize, rookie. Let's move. They intercepted Malcolm mid-stride, near a Starbucks kiosk, between the arrival's escalator and the restroom corridor. Sir, stop right there. Malcolm turned, eyes sharp, expression unreadable. Is there a problem, officers? He asked evenly. McKenna stepped in close. You match the description of a suspicious individual reported in this area. What description would that be? Malcolm asked calmly. Male. Black. Wearing dark clothing. Traveling alone. That's your entire description. McKenna's jaw tightened. We're doing our job. Identification, now. Malcolm slowly reached inside his jacket, never breaking eye contact, and produced a Virginia driver's license. McKenna snatched it. Malcolm Reddick, he read aloud, smirking. From DC Fancy. What brings you to our lovely city? Transit, Malcolm replied. On my way to DC. On business? Cole asked. Yes. Some kind of black ops meeting. McKenna added, a sneer creeping into his voice. Maybe moving something you don't want us to see. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. You're crossing a line, officer. McKenna leaned in, his breath acrid. We ask the questions. You answer them. Or you'll be answering them in cuffs. Malcolm stayed calm. But inside, something coiled. I've done nothing suspicious. I've answered your questions. If there's nothing further, I'd like to be on my way. He stepped forward. McKenna blocked him. You don't walk away from me, he hissed. Put your hands up. Now. For what? Resisting questioning. Acting evasive. I've acted with complete transparency. That's for us to decide. Hands. Now. I will not be detained unlawfully. McKenna turned to Cole. Get him. Now. Wait, sir, Cole started, unsure. I said, get him. Cole grabbed Malcolm's arm. Instinct kicked in. Malcolm pivoted, deflecting the grab, raising his voice for the first time. Do not touch me. That was all the excuse McKenna needed. In seconds, both officers were on him. Malcolm's briefcase hit the floor with a heavy thud. His arms were yanked behind him. Cuffs clicked. Gasps echoed. Someone shouted, "Why are they arresting him?" Another pulled out a phone. A child began to cry. And Malcolm Reddick, veteran of foreign espionage, guardian of national secrets, stood in handcuffs, chest heaving, gaze fixed, lips tight. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. One that every black man in America knows too well. The steel of the handcuffs bit deeper into Malcolm Reddick's wrists as the officers tightened them with practiced indifference. He neither flinched nor resisted. His expression remained unreadable, stoic, like stone under pressure. But something unspoken shifted in the air around him. It wasn't a submission. It was control. Years ago, in a war zone not listed on any map, Malcolm had once faced down a man with a detonator in one hand and death in his eyes. He didn't blink then, and he didn't now. But this was different. That day, in that desert, he had been treated like an asset. Here, in the center of his own country, he was treated like a problem. The police officers didn't see it. They weren't trained to look deeper. To them, Malcolm was just another passenger, another black man who looked too calm to be innocent. His composure irritated them. His poise made them defensive. And his silence? Infuriating. McKenna, the senior officer, grunted as he pushed Malcolm forward. "You're quiet for someone who says he's innocent." Malcolm didn't reply. Cole, trailing slightly behind, adjusted his grip on the satchel he'd taken from Malcolm. "We should check this." Later, McKenna snapped. "Let's get him processed first." Processed. Like a package. Like a threat. Like a number. As they marched through the terminal, Malcolm kept his head high. He felt the stares burning into his back, saw the phone still recording, heard the whispers circling him like vultures. What did he do? Why are they arresting that man? He doesn't look dangerous. A child tugged at her mother's sleeve and asked, "Mommy, why are the police being mean to that man?" The woman pulled her daughter close and didn't answer. Malcolm's shoulders remained squared, his jaw set. He carried not just his dignity, but the weight of every man who'd ever been judged before being heard. The airport security office was as bland and sterile as every other law enforcement office Malcolm had been in, except now, he was on the wrong side of the desk. They sat him in a hard plastic chair beneath a flickering fluorescent bulb. His wrists still bound, his briefcase still unopened. McKenna stood nearby, arms crossed, trying to read Malcolm's expression and failing. Cole paced awkwardly, his anxiety mounting. "You know," McKenna began, circling the seated man like a vulture. "Most people would be sweating by now. Panicking. Pleading. But you sit there like you're the damn mayor or something." "I'm neither panicked nor pleading," Malcolm replied softly. "Because I know who I am." "Do you?" The words hung in the air like smoke, quiet, dense, impossible to ignore. McKenna's smirk faltered. What the officers didn't know, and what would haunt them soon enough, was that Malcolm Reddick had spent the last 30 years learning how to disappear in plain sight. He had operated in embassies and safehouses. Sat across tables from warlords, cybercriminals, and ministers. Interrogated spies. Tracked assets across continents. But most importantly, he had learned the power of patience. The younger Malcolm, back in his 20s, might have shouted. Might have protested on instinct. But the man in this chair had seen systems chew up louder men and spit them out broken. So he waited. Not with fear. But with precision. He let his mind drift back, just briefly, to the last time he'd been in handcuffs. Langley, 1998. Training simulation. He'd volunteered to experience what it felt like to be detained. Know the position of powerlessness, his mentor had said. It'll teach you restraint. And it might one day save your life. At the time, it had felt like an unnecessary exercise. Now, it felt prophetic. Why are you smirking? McKenna barked suddenly. Malcolm met his eyes, calm and direct. I was remembering something your badge wouldn't understand. Cole blinked. McKenna flushed red. I'm done playing with you. Open the bag, McKenna ordered. Cole hesitated. Shouldn't we have a warrant? McKenna snarled. We're at a secure federal terminal. We don't need a damn warrant for a bag search. Malcolm's voice cut through. You're wrong. This isn't a customs checkpoint. And unless you can articulate a specific threat, that's an illegal search. You're about to dig your hole deeper. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. McKenna didn't listen. They pulled out the contents of the satchel, a leather-bound notebook, a secure satellite phone, a worn paperback copy of Invisible Man, and a manila envelope marked, Confidential, NATO Summit. Cole looked at it and froze. Brock, this looks classified. McKenna ripped it open anyway. He didn't understand what he was looking at, only that it had too many acronyms, too many seals, and too many consequences. Malcolm watched them, unreadable. "You just opened an envelope with a NATO intelligence seal," he said, voice low. "You've officially violated federal security protocol." Now it was Cole who turned pale. We should stop. Seriously. This doesn't feel right." McKenna ignored him. But the seed of doubt was planted. For all his confidence, McKenna wasn't a man used to being questioned. He was a man who'd gotten away with just enough bad behavior for just long enough to believe he was untouchable. But Malcolm knew the type. He'd briefed presidents about men like him. "You want to know who I am?" Malcolm asked suddenly. McKenna leaned in, mocking. "Sure. Enlighten me." Malcolm didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked McKenna square in the eye. "I'm the one your bosses call when you screw up beyond containment. I'm the reason certain names never reach the press. I've seen governments fall with less arrogance than you've shown in the last 20 minutes." The silence that followed was deafening. Cole stared at Malcolm, realization creeping into his expression like cold sweat. McKenna backed up a step, but still puffed out his chest. "You expect me to believe you're somebody important, dressed like a CEO in an airport?" "I expect you to do your job with intelligence," Malcolm replied. "But it's clear that's too much to ask." At that moment, a knock sounded on the door. It opened a crack. A uniformed airport supervisor leaned in. "Officers," she said nervously. "There's someone here asking to speak with Mr. Reddick. Says it's urgent." Flashed credentials I've never seen before. McKenna frowned. "Tell them we're conducting an investigation." She blinked. "He says you've got 5 seconds before this becomes a federal incident." Cole's face drained of all color. Outside, through the small office window, several plainclothes agents in dark suits had assembled silently. Their posture, their earpieces, their very presence screamed one thing: this man is not who you think he is. Malcolm exhaled slowly. "Gentlemen," he said, "you may want to uncuff me now." McKenna didn't move. Cole did. Hands trembling, he unlocked the cuffs with an audible click. Malcolm rubbed his wrists and stood. He didn't gloat. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at them both, one gaze full of quiet contempt, the other full of disappointment, and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, he paused. "I'll see you again," he said softly. And then he was gone. The room was silent. McKenna swore under his breath. Cole sat down heavily. "Who the hell is he?" McKenna muttered. Cole didn't answer. Because deep down, he already knew. The moment Malcolm Reddick stepped out of the airport security office, a chill settled in the room, though the air conditioning hadn't changed. Officer Darren Cole stood frozen, one hand still gripping the key he'd used to remove the handcuffs, the other hanging limp by his side. His mouth was dry. His eyes, wide, confused, were fixed on the door as if it might open again and erase everything that had just happened. Across from him, Officer Brock McKenna tried to swallow his fury. Not fear, fury. The kind that builds in men who have gone too far and are now too proud to retreat. "That bastard just played us," McKenna muttered. Cole said nothing. "You see the way he talked? Like he owned the damn room. Who the hell talks like that unless they're bluffing?" Cole blinked. "You saw the men outside. You saw their credentials. Could be actors for all I know. Have you ever thought about that? It's all some game. These people know how to twist everything. Play the victim 1 minute, then pull strings the next. These people." The words hit the air like acid. They didn't need an explanation. They were soaked in generations of resentment and bias. Darren had heard them before, from uncles, from neighbors, from locker room conversations where people laughed too loudly and said too little of value. But here, said aloud by a man in uniform, they made his stomach twist. The hallway outside was still buzzing. Malcolm had vanished into a sea of suits and stern-faced agents. The airport crowd was returning to normal, but the bystanders' eyes, especially those who had recorded the arrest, were watching. Some of them weren't even hiding their disgust anymore. Whispers moved like wildfire. Did you see the way that officer grabbed him? He didn't do anything. Not a thing. Classic. Black man in a suit. Must be guilty. A woman in a red coat muttered under her breath, they wouldn't dare do that to a white executive. And that was the moment McKenna snapped. He stormed out of the room, pushed past 2 TSA guards, and marched into the main terminal. Hey, he barked at the nearest person holding up their phone. You can't film law enforcement during an investigation. The young woman didn't even flinch. I'm in a public space. You assaulted a civilian. Her voice was calm. Her phone didn't waver. McKenna's jaw clenched. Cole grabbed his shoulder. Brock. Let it go. But McKenna shook him off. His authority, his pride, his whole idea of control, it was slipping away. And he hated the man who'd taken it from him. Hours later, they sat back at the precinct. Officer McKenna was typing a draft of the incident report, and with every key he struck, the words sounded more like a justification than a recounting. Every sentence framed Malcolm as uncooperative, defensive, unusually calm, as though composure was criminal, as though not being afraid was a red flag. Cole watched silently. You're not gonna add the part about him being who he is? Cole asked eventually. McKenna didn't look up. No proof of that. No ID. No confirmation. Far as I'm concerned, he's some smooth talker with friends in black suits. Cole lowered his voice. But what if it's true? McKenna stopped typing. If it's true, he said coldly, then we just got taught a lesson in humiliation. And I don't take kindly to that. He stood up, pushed the report aside, and poured himself a cup of stale coffee. The bitterness matched the knot in his chest. It's always the same, he muttered. We do our jobs, and they turn us into villains. One bad call, and suddenly we're the face of injustice. Maybe because it wasn't just a bad call, Cole replied, his voice barely audible. Maybe it was something more. He didn't want to say it. But it had been gnawing at him since the beginning. From the moment McKenna had pointed at Malcolm in the crowd with that smug confidence. From the way McKenna had used people like him as justification. From the way Malcolm's intelligence had threatened McKenna more than any weapon ever could. What they'd done wasn't just an overreaction. It was profiling. It was personal. And now Cole couldn't shake the memory of Malcolm's silence. How he had taken every insult, every shove, every accusation not with weakness, but with restraint. Not once had he begged. Not once had he raised his voice. And somehow, that composure had revealed more power than any badge on their belts. That night, Malcolm Reddick sat alone in his DC hotel suite, staring at the faint red marks on his wrists. They were already fading. But the memory remained raw. He hadn't told his team yet. He hadn't called the press. He hadn't even called his daughter. He simply sat there, reflecting. For a man trained to anticipate terrorist threats, decode encrypted intelligence, and deconstruct political disinformation, the greatest threat he had faced in years had come from something far more insidious. A uniform with unchecked prejudice. A badge without accountability. A man like McKenna. He remembered McKenna's face, not the anger, but the smirk. That crooked little smirk that said, "I can get away with this. I've done it before." And Malcolm knew that was the real enemy. It wasn't McKenna himself. It was the system that allowed McKenna to exist unchecked. The chain of silence, of paperwork closed quietly, of complaints reviewed and dismissed. The blue wall. The whisper network. The code of loyalty that protected men not because they were right, but because they wore the same badge. And it had almost worked again. If he hadn't been who he was. If he had lacked rank, connections, or calm, he could have been cuffed, booked, and forgotten. That was what haunted him. He only survived the encounter with his dignity because he carried a title behind his name. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Officer Cole couldn't sleep. He stayed late at his desk, watching the footage from his body camera. He rewatched the moment when Malcolm said, "I know who I am." "Do you?" It struck him differently now. He saw how quickly it had gone from routine check to public arrest. How flimsy the justification had been. How eager McKenna had been to escalate. And most of all, he saw himself, silent, complicit, compliant. Cole closed the laptop and buried his face in his hands. The next morning, Cole submitted a sealed envelope to Internal Affairs. Inside, a written statement. His own. It began with a single line. "I believe the arrest made on Malcolm Reddick was based not on behavior, but on bias." It was the first domino. It would not be the last. It began with a name. Not the name on a driver's license. Not the name muttered through clenched teeth during an arrest. It was a name spoken with quiet finality, delivered not in rage or arrogance, but in the cool, deliberate tone of a man who had nothing left to prove. "I'm Malcolm Reddick," he said, his wrists still red from the cuffs. "Director of Homeland Counterintelligence." And for a moment, the entire airport stopped breathing. Officer Brock McKenna blinked. Once. Then again. "What?" he said, the word caught somewhere between disbelief and defiance. "I said," Malcolm repeated, voice calm, "I am the Director of Homeland Counterintelligence." His tone was unwavering. Each syllable dropped like a stone into a pond of panic. McKenna looked at him, then at Cole, then at the small crowd forming at a cautious distance. Some were already whispering. Others were filming. The handcuffs, now unlatched and hanging loose in Cole's trembling fingers, gleamed under the terminal's artificial lights. The leather satchel McKenna had rummaged through sat beside Malcolm's briefcase, still half spilled on the floor. None of them moved. And yet, the entire room shifted. Malcolm didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, adjusting the sleeves of his suit jacket, as if the most traumatic public humiliation of his life were just another inconvenience, like lost luggage or a delayed flight. But his eyes said everything. They burned with centuries of restraint. McKenna opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He took a half step back, his face blanching from red to a ghostly white. Sweat beaded across his brow. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Wait," he said finally. You can't just say that and expect." Malcolm raised a hand. "Officer," he interrupted, coolly. "Don't make this worse." Cole was the first to act. His training kicked in, or maybe it was just common sense finally piercing through the fog of denial. He bent down, retrieved the handcuff key, and, after fumbling with it for a tense few seconds, freed Malcolm's wrists completely. "Sir," he murmured, barely audible. I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Malcolm replied, without looking at him. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a fact. McKenna, on the other hand, stood frozen, caught between two terrible truths. That he had just unlawfully detained one of the most powerful men in the country, or that he was still in denial of what his prejudice had blinded him to. "You're bluffing," he spat. "You think throwing out some fake title's gonna scare me?" Malcolm turned fully to face him now. His voice remained low, but it carried like a thunderclap. "You opened a federal envelope marked classified. You detained a U.S. counterintelligence official under pretenses. You verbally harassed and physically restrained a government diplomat without probable cause. And you did it all on camera." He took a step forward. "Still think I'm bluffing?" It was then that the air around them began to shift again, this time with purpose. From the terminal's east corridor, a group of men and women in tailored suits and discreet earpieces emerged with urgency. They moved not like civilians or even local police, but with the confidence of people who operated above both. At their front was a tall black man in a charcoal suit and silver-rimmed glasses. His badge was out before anyone asked. "Agent Wallace, Internal Security Division. We're here for Director Reddick." The use of the title, Director, landed like a hammer. No more ambiguity. No more disbelief. Gasps erupted among the onlookers. Several people lowered their phones, not out of fear but out of reverence. "Sir, are you all right?" Wallace asked, his tone not just professional but personal. "I'm fine," Malcolm replied. "But I want everything preserved. All recordings. All footage. Especially body cams." Wallace nodded. "Already secured." He turned to the stunned officers. "You two," he said to McKenna and Cole. "Hand over your weapons, badges, and body cams. Now." Cole complied immediately. His hands shook as he unclipped his belt and handed over his firearm and badge. He didn't make eye contact. He didn't say a word. McKenna didn't move. "Officer," Wallace said more firmly, "I won't ask again." Still, McKenna stood, lips tight, eyes darting like a trapped animal's. Wallace stepped closer. "You just laid hands on a federal official. If you don't want this to escalate into an obstruction charge on top of everything else, you'll do as I say. Now." McKenna's jaw clenched. Then, slowly, with visible rage leaking through every movement, he unbuckled his belt and surrendered his gear. Wallace nodded once. "Thank you. You are both now suspended pending full investigation by the Department of Justice and the Office of Civil Rights. You will be escorted to the security office until federal agents arrive." He signaled two plainclothes agents, who flanked the officers and began guiding them away. McKenna turned to Malcolm as he passed, hatred simmering in his eyes. "You set us up." Malcolm stared back, ice cold. "No, officer. You set yourself up the moment you let bias take the place of judgment." It didn't take long for the ripple effect to begin. Within 30 minutes, the footage had made its way to both Internal Affairs and the FBI's Central Command. Within the hour, Malcolm's chief of staff had received a call from the Attorney General. By nightfall, major news outlets had picked up pieces of the incident from social media clips, though no one yet knew the man in the video was a federal intelligence director. And by morning, the headlines exploded. Top intelligence official wrongfully detained at O'Hare. Federal director cuffed by local cops in suspected racial profiling case. Who is Malcolm Reddick, and why are law enforcement agencies scrambling? Back in D.C., in a secure government facility on Pennsylvania Avenue, a group of national security advisors huddled around a large screen showing the airport footage. Malcolm stood beside the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Homeland Security as they reviewed the sequence of events. The room was silent as the video played, McKenna's shouting, Cole's hesitation, Malcolm's calm refusal, and the ultimate moment of truth. When it ended, no one spoke for a moment. Finally, the secretary broke the silence. What do you want to do? Malcolm's eyes were heavy, but his voice was clear. I don't want revenge. I want accountability. And I want this system to stop protecting those who abuse their badge. He paused, then added, we will not bury this. We'll expose it. All of it. The DNI nodded solemnly. You'll have our full support. Meanwhile, in a dim holding room beneath the Chicago precinct, Brock McKenna sat with his hands clenched and eyes blank. He had been stripped not only of his badge but of the illusion that his authority would always protect him. Across from him, Darren Cole sat staring at the wall. Finally, he turned. I filed a statement, Cole said. McKenna looked up. What? I submitted a written report. Told the truth. What we did. What you said. McKenna's face twisted. You stabbed me in the back. No, Cole replied quietly. I'm trying to stop the bleeding. When systems break, they don't do it all at once. Not with a bang, but with a fracture, silent, creeping, deadly. And the arrest of Malcolm Reddick had just opened a fault line under one of the most powerful institutions in America. The first fracture came from within. By noon the following day, the Office of Professional Standards and Internal Affairs for the Chicago Police Department launched an emergency review of the incident. But it wasn't just about two officers anymore. It was about what allowed them to operate with impunity for so long. McKenna's personnel file was thick and troubling. Over 24 years, he had amassed over 30 internal complaints, ranging from excessive force to racially charged language to questionable detainments that never resulted in charges. Most of the complaints had been informally resolved. Several had disappeared altogether. Whistleblower officers, previously silenced by fear or futility, began coming forward. One anonymous lieutenant shared in a confidential deposition. McKenna knew where the line was. He danced on it like it was a stage. He was protected because he made arrests and never rocked the political boat. And therein lay the second fracture, protection through performance. The system had favored statistics over justice. Officers who produced numbers, tickets, arrests, citations, were promoted or protected. McKenna had been a producer. And the system had covered for his bias in exchange for results. But now those results were being re-examined, line by line. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division formally opened a federal civil rights investigation into the incident. The head of the unit, an iron-willed prosecutor named Helen Kwan, led the charge. She addressed a room of seasoned attorneys with a single, cutting sentence. This is no longer about an individual. This is about a pattern. And this time, the pattern ends. She ordered subpoenas for every case involving McKenna in the last 10 years. Forensics teams began to digitally reconstruct incidents from body cam archives. Algorithms were deployed to analyze language use in arrest reports, searching for bias indicators. And they found them. Over and over. Phrases like nervous demeanor, aggressive tone, and suspicious posture all applied disproportionately to men and women of color. All were used to justify searches, stops, and detainments that rarely led to charges. The data didn't lie. But it had taken Malcolm Reddick's arrest to force the system to see it. Malcolm himself remained mostly silent in public. He refused interviews. Declined comment. But behind closed doors, he was everywhere. He met with the Attorney General, the FBI Director, and even the President's Chief of Staff. He presented not just a timeline of the incident, but a blueprint for reform. One that would stretch far beyond his case. He proposed mandatory third-party audits of officer conduct records. Suggested AI-assisted bias detection in report language. Recommended immediate federal intervention when officers crossed certain red flags. But most of all, he advocated for a cultural shift. We can't train away what leadership tolerates, he told the Homeland Security Council. You want a different outcome? Create a system where misconduct isn't just punished, it's prevented. It was a powerful message. And it landed. Because Malcolm didn't speak as a politician or a victim. He spoke as someone who had spent decades working within the very machine that had turned on him. He knew where the wires were frayed. And now, he had the country's attention. Back in Chicago, the city was bracing for backlash. Protesters began gathering outside the CPD headquarters. Signs read, "He wasn't a suspect. He was the director. This time you picked the wrong man. Power saved him. What about the rest of us?" Community leaders, clergy, veterans, and civil rights attorneys took to the podiums in every neighborhood. They didn't just talk about Malcolm. They talked about Marvin, the high school senior who was arrested for loitering outside his apartment. About Angela, a nurse who was forced to the ground during a traffic stop. About Tyrone, who never made it home. The point was clear. Malcolm was protected by position. But what happens when the next black man isn't the director of anything? The crowd cheered. And the system trembled again. Inside the CPD, leadership scrambled to maintain order. Chief Ronald Massey, a polished administrator with a weakness for optics, held a press conference to announce immediate accountability measures. He said all the right words. This incident does not reflect the values of our department. We will conduct a full review. We are committed to transparency and justice. But his hands were shaking. Because he knew what Malcolm knew. The cover-ups were over. Meanwhile, McKenna and Cole were sequestered pending formal charges. McKenna was irate, defiant, still claiming innocence. "This is political," he spat during an internal hearing. "He baited us." But Cole was quieter now. Thoughtful. Changed. He had requested an interview with the DOJ investigators. Not to save himself, but to tell the truth. He admitted that the stop had no basis. That Malcolm's calmness had been twisted into defiance. That McKenna's racial slurs weren't new, they were routine. His testimony cracked the last line of defense. Because Cole's statement didn't just match Malcolm's story, it aligned with the footage. The body cam didn't lie. The cameras had caught everything, the smirks, the curses, the grabbing, the violent takedown. And the moment Malcolm said, "I'm the director of Homeland Counterintelligence." It was cinematic. But it was also damning. A week later, the Justice Department issued its formal findings. The actions of officers McKenna and Cole constitute a willful deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Their conduct reflects systemic failures in supervision, training, and accountability within the Chicago Police Department. We are recommending federal prosecution under Title 18 U.S. Code Section 242. The news broke like thunder. CNN. MSNBC. The New York Times. Even international outlets covered it. Top U.S. intelligence official targeted in racial profiling incident, BBC. America's hidden justice crisis, Le Monde. Director detained, system exposed, Al Jazeera. For the first time, the world was watching the system unravel from within. Malcolm watched the coverage alone in his D.C. office. The light from the TV flickered across his face. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just watched. He knew the weight of what was happening. This wasn't just his moment. It was a reckoning long overdue. But also incomplete. Because for every case like his, there were hundreds, thousands that never made the news. That never had a camera. That ended in a cell. Or worse. So as the headlines rolled and the ticker tape scrolled, Malcolm picked up a pen and began drafting something new, a white paper titled Silent Threats, Reforming the Frontlines of Law Enforcement. He would finish it. And then he would bring it to Congress. In a city that often forgot its truths, a new chapter was being written, not in whispers, but in declarations. Not in back rooms, but in full view. And at the center of it stood a man who never raised his voice, but changed the country by standing still. The courtroom was silent. Not the silence of peace, but of tension, of history, of reckoning. A silence so thick it wrapped around the ceiling fans and settled in the woodgrain of the judge's bench. It was the kind of silence that told everyone, from the reporters to the court stenographer, that they weren't just here for a trial. They were here for a moment in American history. The case of United States versus Officers Brock McKenna and Darren Cole had reached the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. But its meaning rippled far beyond Chicago. It had become, in essence, a trial of the very system that for decades had blurred the line between policing and prejudice. And at the center of it all sat Malcolm Reddick. He took the stand on the third day of the trial. The court rose as he approached. Not because of his title, no one announced that, but because there was something about the man that demanded respect. He wore a dark navy suit. No tie. His eyes, sharp and still, swept across the room like an old general surveying a battlefield. He raised his right hand. Swore to tell the truth. Saturday. And then he spoke. Not with fury. Not with vengeance. But with clarity. On the afternoon of March 4th, I was returning from a security summit in Berlin. I passed through Gate B12 at O'Hare International Airport en route to my connection to Washington, D.C. I was stopped by two officers. I asked why. The answer was vague. I responded with legal rights. I was told I was being uncooperative. Then I was handcuffed, publicly, in front of hundreds of people. The prosecutor let him recount every detail in his own words. The courtroom was transfixed. Even the jury, 12 citizens from different walks of life, leaned forward. At no point was I aggressive. At no point did I refuse a lawful order. But I was judged, not by my actions, but by my presence. I wasn't seen as a person. I was seen as a threat. He paused. Then added, almost as an afterthought, but one that cracked the walls of the room. And I wasn't the first. I just happened to be visible. The footage was next. Body cam from McKenna. Body cam from Cole. It played across 3 monitors for the court to see. There was no background music. No dramatic voiceover. Only raw reality. The arrest. The sarcasm. The racial insinuations. The aggression is masked as a procedure. The moment Malcolm said his name. The moment they laughed. The moment they stopped laughing. There was no need to explain it. The images said what words never could. Several jurors looked away. One wiped her eyes. The defense tried to salvage what they could. They painted McKenna as a hardened officer under pressure, a man trained to identify threats in ambiguous, high-tension environments. They called Cole a young officer, caught in the shadow of a powerful mentor, a man who regretted every second of that encounter. But their arguments crumbled under the weight of the evidence. Because this wasn't about a bad day. This was about a bad pattern. The prosecution, led by U.S. Attorney Julia Mendoza, delivered blow after blow with surgical precision. She brought in data analysts who showed racial bias in McKenna's report language over the past decade. She introduced internal memos ignored by supervisors. She revealed a system that had enabled not just misconduct, but malpractice of power. This case is not about whether officers made a mistake, she told the court. This case is about what happens when a uniform becomes a shield for bias, and a weapon for control. And then she pointed to Malcolm, seated at the witness stand, still as a statue. The only reason we're here today, she said, is because the man they chose to target had power. But what about the ones who don't? What happens when they go home in silence, in shame, or worse, don't go home at all? The room was quiet again. But not numb. It was awakening. McKenna, when called to testify, remained defiant. He didn't apologize. He didn't admit fault. Instead, he stuck to a single thread: he was doing his job. He fit the description, he said. He was acting too calm. That's what threw me off. That's usually how people hide something. Julia Mendoza didn't flinch. So being calm is now probable cause? McKenna hesitated. Sometimes, it is. There were audible gasps from the gallery. And in that moment, the jury saw not just a man on trial, but a belief system unspooling under cross-examination. Cole's testimony was different. He didn't try to save himself. He admitted his part. Admitted the fear. Admitted the failure to intervene. I should have said no, he told the court. I should have stopped him. I should have stopped myself. When asked why he didn't, he looked at Malcolm. Then at the jury. Because I was trained to follow, not to think. It was one of the most damning lines of the entire trial. Not because it excused him, but because it explained so many others. Closing arguments came on day 9. Julia Mendoza stood in the center of the courtroom and addressed the jury. This case will go down in history. But how it goes down depends on you. Will you see this as an isolated incident, or will you see it as what it is, a warning sign? A demand for change? A line in the sand? The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they returned, the entire room stood. Malcolm didn't move. Not until the foreman spoke. On the charge of willful deprivation of rights under color of law, we, the jury, find the defendant, Brock McKenna, guilty. On the charge of unlawful detention, guilty. On the charge of assault, guilty. Then came Darren Cole. On the charge of willful deprivation of rights under color of law, guilty. On the charge of unlawful detention, guilty. He closed his eyes. McKenna did not. He simply stared straight ahead, as if refusing to accept the verdict even as it thundered through the courtroom. Sentencing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. But the impact came instantly. News broke across every major outlet. Cable news anchors called it a landmark verdict. Think tanks released immediate analyses. The Reddick case, beginning of a new standard. And in cities across America, departments launched reviews of officer conduct archives. Internal audit committees were formed. Laws were proposed. It had started. Finally. Outside the courtroom, Malcolm was asked by a journalist if he felt vindicated. He paused. Then answered. This wasn't about vindication. It was about truth. And truth doesn't always comfort. Sometimes, it convicts. He turned and walked down the steps, not as a man who had won, but as a man who had endured. And in that walk, the system shook again. The morning after the verdict, Washington, D.C., was blanketed in a soft, amber fog. The city moved as it always did, detached, determined, unforgiving. But inside the tall glass windows of the Hoover Building, one man stood still. He faced Pennsylvania Avenue with both hands tucked behind his back, as the sun struggled to pierce through the haze. Malcolm Reddick had been up since 4. He had not spoken much since returning from Chicago. The whirlwind of interviews, calls from cabinet officials, even a brief note from the president himself, had been left unanswered. His voicemail blinked with messages from senators, global leaders, and even an old friend from West Point. But he hadn't replied to any of them. He needed quiet. Because something inside him was shifting, and he didn't yet know what to do with it. On his desk lay the case file. Not the one from the Justice Department. His own. Pages of handwritten notes. Diagrams. Chronologies. Marginalia in black ink. The kind of dossier he used to assemble when tracking a high-level threat. But this wasn't an enemy combatant. It was the truth. His truth. He had documented every detail. Not just the incident, but the aftershocks, how fast the investigation had moved, how thoroughly the media had responded, how swiftly the verdict had been reached. Too swiftly. That was what haunted him. Not the swiftness of justice. But what it revealed. The only reason justice had been so clean, so complete, was because it had happened to him. Because he was Malcolm Reddick. Because he had credentials, clearance, and camera footage. Because the agents came when he called. Because the courtroom listened when he spoke. And that wasn't justice. That was privilege in uniform. He walked over to the side table and poured himself a cup of black coffee. No sugar. No cream. The same way he drank it in Kabul. In Kiev. In Cairo. In Chicago. His eyes landed on a photograph tucked beneath the edge of a manila folder. It was worn and faded, taken some 25 years ago. A younger Malcolm stood on the steps of a courthouse, in uniform, shaking hands with a federal judge. He looked proud. He looked naive. The Malcolm in the photo still believed the system could be fixed with honor and structure. The Malcolm staring back from the window had learned otherwise. He picked up a pen and started writing. This time, not for a memo or brief. But for himself. The world only listened because I had power. Had I been anyone else, I would have been processed, booked, and forgotten. He paused. This country does not suffer from a lack of laws. It suffers from selective enforcement. The system isn't broken. It was built this way. He underlined that last sentence twice. Then he sat back, staring at the words until they blurred. At exactly 8:15 a.m., his assistant, Renee, knocked gently on the door. "Sir. You have a video call with the Civil Rights Oversight Committee in 15 minutes. He didn't answer. She stepped in, cautiously. He was still by the window. "Would you like me to cancel?" she asked softly. "No," he said. His voice was quiet, but clear. "Let them wait. Let them feel what it's like to not be the most powerful voice in the room." Renee nodded. She understood more than he said. The day moved forward in fragments. He met with analysts about a potential counterintelligence leak in the Baltic. He signed off on a surveillance restriction order related to a Senate inquiry. He even gave a short briefing to a visiting delegation from Japan. But in every interaction, his mind drifted. To a mother he'd seen crying outside the Chicago courtroom. To the young boy clutching her hand, eyes wide, asking why the police were scared of the truth. To the quiet nod of Officer Darren Cole as he was led away, a man who finally saw the line he'd crossed and couldn't uncross. To the face of Brock McKenna, still convinced the law was on his side until it wasn't. To the stillness in the room when Malcolm had said, "I'm the Director of Homeland Counterintelligence." And to the thousands of people who would never have the chance to say those words, because no one would ever believe them if they did. That evening, Malcolm walked home. He declined the armored car. Declined the agent's tail. He wore a long wool coat, a dark gray scarf, and simple black gloves. Pedestrians passed him without recognition. He liked it that way. Somewhere near 14th and Constitution, he stopped at a street corner. The light was red. A police cruiser rolled past, slowly. Its headlights swept over his coat. The officer inside didn't even glance at him. Malcolm's heart tightened. Why? Because, for the first time in years, he noticed it. The way his posture straightened. The way his breath caught. The way a uniform still triggered something ancient in his chest, ancestral, involuntary. He had spent a lifetime learning how to control environments, diffuse threats, and read intent. But he would never unlearn this. He reached his apartment. Took the elevator. Walked into the quiet warmth of his home. He dropped his coat on the chair. Loosened his collar. And sat. In silence. On the bookshelf beside him sat works by Baldwin, Coates, Douglas, and Hannah Jones. Voices that had carried truths into places where silence had once lived. He pulled down one title, The Fire Next Time, and opened to a bookmarked page. He read slowly. Then closed the book. He looked out the window at the city blinking beneath him. The Capitol Dome. The Washington Monument. The gleam of distant sirens echoed into the distance. And then he whispered, to no one but himself. Justice isn't justice until it serves the powerless. He stood. Walked to his desk. And began to write again. The auditorium wasn't large. It wasn't grand. No marble columns or national seals adorned the walls. Just concrete floors, folding chairs, and the smell of coffee lingering from the morning. But what it lacked in ceremony, it made up for in truth. Because those seated in the crowd were not politicians or diplomats. They were teachers. Single parents. Former inmates. Community leaders. Veterans. Students. People from every walk of life, who had one thing in common: they had seen the headlines, followed the trial, and now came to hear from the man at the center of it all. Malcolm Reddick stood alone on the stage. No podium. No teleprompter. Only a chair, a glass of water, and a quiet room were waiting for something real. He looked out over the sea of faces and exhaled. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he spoke softly at first. Most people only know the end of the story. They saw the footage, read the verdict, and saw two officers escorted away in handcuffs. What they didn't see was what it cost to get there. He paused. It cost silence. It costs dignity. It cost the pain of every black man, woman, and child who ever walked through a public place and wondered, what will they see when they look at me? The crowd was still. Not because they were unengaged, but because every word felt familiar. I've spent my career watching this country fight enemies overseas. I've interrogated spies, dismantled terror plots, decrypted messages that could have brought down entire cities. But I've never faced a threat more enduring than the one that lives in the quiet corners of our institutions, the threat of normalized bias. The kind that doesn't shout, but whispers. That doesn't strike, but waits. That doesn't break laws, but bends them, just enough to ruin someone's life without leaving a scar. He let the silence breathe. Then his voice grew firmer. What happened to me should never have happened. But it did. Not because the system failed. But because it functioned exactly as it was designed to, until it was forced to look at itself. I wasn't saved because the law worked. I was saved because I had power. He looked across the audience, locking eyes with a young black man in the third row, a Latina mother in the back, and a South Asian student scribbling notes. But justice that depends on power is not justice at all. There were nods now. Eyes shimmering. Some were filled with tears. Not for pity. But for recognition. I was lucky. But luck cannot be our policy. We need a system that doesn't rely on your title to validate your humanity. We need officers who don't see skin color as a threat indicator. We need laws that don't just punish the guilty, but protect the vulnerable before harm is done. He took a step forward, closer to the crowd. But policy alone won't fix this. We need culture. We need neighbors who speak up. Teachers who challenge assumptions. Employers who question unfair hiring practices. Friends who don't stay silent when injustice walks into the room. He paused. Then his voice dropped, deep, warm, personal. I know this is hard. I know it's easier to scroll past than speak up. Easier to say, that's not my business, than to risk discomfort. But silence is not neutrality. Silence is permission. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this: use your voice. Whether you have a badge, a ballot, or a classroom, use it. Whether you write, protest, lead, or simply raise a child to be better than we were, use it. Because justice isn't built in courtrooms. It's built in communities. He stepped back now, letting the words hang. The applause didn't come immediately. It rose slowly, like a wave gathering strength, not because they were impressed, but because they were moved. People weren't clapping for a speech. They were clapping for a shift. A turning point. A mirror. Afterward, people lined up to shake his hand. Some brought children. Others simply nodded, placing their palm over their heart. One man whispered, "My son, he didn't survive his encounter. Thank you for surviving yours." Malcolm held his hand a second longer. "I'll carry him forward," he promised. And he meant it. That night, he returned to his apartment. The city lights blinked below. He poured a glass of water. Sat by the window. And opened the file on his desk. It was the final draft of his reform proposal. Title: Invisible No More, Building Civilian-Led Justice Systems for Law Enforcement Accountability. Inside were policy frameworks, cultural initiatives, and training blueprints. But more importantly, there were testimonies gathered from the voices that had once been ignored. It would be presented before Congress the following week. He'd already received bipartisan support. But even if they rejected it, he would continue. Because the fight wasn't about legislation. It was about legacy. As midnight crept across D.C., Malcolm Reddick closed his eyes. Not in retreat. But in renewal. Tomorrow, there will be another room. Another microphone. Another voice that needed lifting. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of peace, not because justice had arrived. But because he had chosen not to stop. And that's where real power lives, not in who you are, but in what you refuse to accept. In a world where silence too often protects injustice, the story of Malcolm Reddick reminds us that dignity is not determined by title, and justice must never depend on rank. This isn't just a tale of one man's wrongful arrest, it's a mirror held up to society, revealing how deeply biased it can run when left unchecked. The true power of this story lies not in the courtroom victory, but in what it asks each of us: will we remain silent witnesses, or become active defenders of justice? You don't need to wear a badge or hold a high office to make a difference. You only need courage to speak up when it's easier to stay quiet, to stand up when others look away, to believe that every human being deserves to be seen as more than a profile. Malcolm's victory was not personal, it was a call to action for communities, leaders, and ordinary citizens to demand better and be better. If this story moved you, share it. Let it reach someone who needs the reminder that they matter, they're not alone, and change is possible. Like, subscribe, and share this video to help spread stories that awaken, inspire, and empower. Because justice only begins with awareness, but it continues with you.